Colorado, 1888. There's a kind of arithmetic the heart learns after a great loss, a counting of days that proves only that subtraction is the one true rule of the world. Silas Blackwood knew this arithmetic. He knew it in the quiet of his two-story ranch house, a house built for the sound of a wife's laughter and the scuff of children's boots, a house that now held only the echo of their absence. He had built it with his own hands for Martha, and when the fever took her and their boy Samuel in the same cruel winter 5 years past, the house had become a monument to what was gone. It was too large. Every empty room was a number in his grim calculation. His life had settled into a rhythm of chores, a metronome of necessity that kept the silence at bay. He rose before the sun, his boots sounding hollow on the floorboards. He made coffee, 1 cup, and drank it standing at the window, looking out over the land that stretched east toward the plains. The land was the only thing that hadn't changed. It was still demanding, still honest. It asked for his sweat and his attention, and in return it gave him a reason to see the sun rise and set. It did not ask for his joy. Gus, his blue heeler, would sit by his feet, his head resting on Silas's boot. The dog was a creature of the present tense, unburdened by the past. Sometimes Silas would rest a hand on the dog's head and feel a flicker of something, a connection to a living thing that expected nothing more than what he was already giving. It was enough. He had told himself that for 5 years. It was enough. He had stopped expecting. That was the core of it. He had stopped looking for joy in the turn of a season or warmth in a neighbor's greeting. He was polite, of course. He was a decent man. He tipped his hat to the ladies in town. He paid his bills on time at Henderson's Mercantile. He helped his neighbors when a calf was lost or a fence was down. But he did it all from a distance, from behind a wall of quiet observance. He did his part, and then he returned to his empty house, to the arithmetic of one. 1 man, 1 dog, 1 cup of coffee. The Miller place, the small cabin, and 30 acres that bordered his own property to the south, had been empty for as long as he could remember. Old Man Miller had died years ago, and his children, scattered to the winds of the east, had let it fall to ruin. The roof sagged, the porch tilted, and the weeds had claimed the small garden plot. Silas barely noticed it anymore. It was just another piece of the landscape, a quiet testament to decay, until the wagon came. He saw it from the barn, a speck of movement on the dusty road that led past his property. It was a single, rickety wagon, pulled by a tired-looking horse, piled high with what looked to be the entirety of someone's worldly possessions. It wasn't much: a trunk, a rocking chair, a few crates. The wagon didn't continue on toward town. It stopped at the broken gate of the Miller place. Silas stood still, a curry comb in his hand, and watched. A figure climbed down from the wagon seat. A woman. She was alone. From this distance he could tell little about her, only that she moved with a kind of weary purpose. She pushed at the gate, which groaned and sagged but did not open. After a moment, she walked around it, her step sure in the tall grass. She stood on the tilted porch of the derelict cabin and surveyed her new domain. Gus let out a low growl, not of aggression, but of inquiry. Silas put a hand on his back. "Easy, boy." He did not know who she was or where she came from. He did not want to know. A new neighbor was a complication, a new variable in his carefully managed equation. He finished grooming his horse, his movements deliberate, trying to push the image of the lone woman on the collapsing porch from his mind. It was not his concern. But later that afternoon, as he was mending a stretch of fence along their shared property line, he saw her again. She was wrestling with the old well pump. Her sleeves were rolled up and a smudge of dirt streaked her cheek. He could see her more clearly now. She was younger than he'd first thought, perhaps not yet 30. Her hair was the color of dried corn silk, pulled back in a severe bun that had already begun to fray in the wind. She was thin, but there was a sturdiness to her posture, a refusal to bend. He watched her work for a long time, longer than he should have. He knew that pump. Miller had cursed it for years. It needed a new leather gasket, and the handle was half seized with rust. She would never get it to draw water, not like that. He should go over. He should tell her. A neighborly gesture. That's all it would be. He stayed where he was. He told himself it was because he didn't want to intrude. He told himself she hadn't asked for help. But the truth was simpler. Helping her would require conversation. It would require an opening, a crack in the wall he had so carefully built around himself. And he did not know if he had the words for it anymore. So he hammered another fence staple into the post, the sharp sound of it unnaturally loud in the quiet air, and he went back to his work. The next morning, he saw her walking toward his house. She carried an empty bucket. Gus announced her arrival with a series of sharp, questioning barks. Silas stepped out onto his porch, wiping his hands on a rag. She stopped at the bottom of the steps, not wanting to presume an invitation. "Morning," she said. Her voice was clear, lower than he'd expected. It held no plea, only a statement of fact. "Morning," he replied, his own voice rusty from disuse. "My well's dry," she said, lifting the bucket slightly. "Or the pump is busted. I was wondering if I could trouble you for some water until I can get it sorted." "Pump's busted," he said. "Needs a new gasket." She nodded, a small, accepting motion. She didn't ask why he hadn't told her yesterday. She didn't seem to expect he should have. "I see. My name is Alara Vance." She corrected herself quickly, a faint flush rising on her cheeks. "No, Alara Stevens. My husband. He passed. Vance was his name." Silas just nodded. He understood loss. He didn't need the details. "Silas Blackwood." He took the bucket from her. "Wait here." He went to his own well, the handle moving smoothly in his practiced grip, the cool, clear water splashing into the bucket. When he returned, she was standing exactly where he had left her gaze fixed on the distant mountains. She wasn't looking at his house, wasn't judging its size or its emptiness. She was looking at the land. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood," she said, taking the heavy bucket. She didn't struggle with the weight. "I've got a spare gasket in the barn," he heard himself say. The words came out before he could stop them. "For the pump. I can bring it over later." Her eyes, the color of a stormy sky, met his for the first time. There was a flicker of surprise in them, but it was quickly gone. "I'd be grateful," she said. And then she turned and walked back toward her cabin, her back straight, the bucket handle gripped firmly in her hand. Silas watched her go. He felt a strange unease, a disruption in the quiet order of his days. He had offered help. He had invited a connection, however small. He went back inside his house, and the silence felt different. It felt heavier. Later that day, he took the gasket over. He found her on her knees, pulling weeds from the choked garden plot with a fierce determination. She had already managed to fix the sagging porch step and had scrubbed the windows until they shone. The place already looked less like a ruin and more like a home waiting to be reclaimed. He fixed the pump for her. It was a simple job for him, one he'd done a dozen times. She stood by and watched, not with the helplessness he'd seen in some women, but with a focused attention, learning how the pieces fit together. She asked smart questions. She handed him the right tool before he even had to ask for it. They barely spoke otherwise. The work was the conversation. When he was done, he worked the handle, and after a few dry coughs, water gushed forth, dark with rust and sediment at first, then clearing to a clean, steady stream. "There," he said. She cupped her hands under the flow, rinsed them, and then drank. She looked up at him, water dripping from her chin. "I owe you for the gasket, and for your time." "It was nothing," he said, turning to leave. "Mr. Blackwood," she called after him. He stopped. I plan to make this place work. I'm not looking for charity, but I thank you for the neighborly welcome." He just nodded and walked away. He did not know what to make of her. He did not know what to make of the feeling that settled in his chest, a feeling that was not quite warmth, but was no longer the familiar chill of solitude. The weeks turned into a month. A quiet rhythm established itself between their two properties. He would see her light in the mornings, a small yellow square against the pre-dawn gloom, and know he was not the only one awake. He watched her work. She moved with an economy of motion that spoke of a life that had not been easy. She repaired the roof with shingles she scavenged from a collapsed shed. She tilled the garden by hand, turning the hard, dry soil with a shovel and a stubborn will. She bought a few chickens in town, and their cheerful clucking became a new sound on the wind. He never offered help again, and she never asked for it. But sometimes he would leave a cord of split firewood stacked near her woodpile while she was in town, and the next morning he would find a jar of freshly canned wild preserves on his own porch. No notes were exchanged, no words were needed. It was a silent barter, a language of action that they both understood. When he went to Henderson's Mercantile for supplies, the inevitable questions came. Mr. Henderson, a man whose curiosity was as reliable as his inventory, leaned over the counter as he weighed out a sack of flour. "That new woman, the widow Stevens," he began, not even trying to be subtle. "She seems to be making a go of it over at the old Miller place." "Seems so," Silas said, his attention fixed on the list in his hand. "Tough piece of land to work alone," Henderson continued, undeterred. "Especially for a woman. She comes in here, buys what she needs, and not a word more. Keeps to herself." He paused, then added, "Thomas Vance has been sniffing around over there. Saw him ride out that way twice last week." Silas felt a muscle in his jaw tighten. Thomas Vance was a rancher from the other side of the valley, a man who had inherited a prosperous spread and carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who had never known real hardship. He was handsome, smooth-tongued, and looking for a wife to complete the picture of his success. "That's so," Silas said, his voice flat. It was not his business. It was nothing to him. A few days later, he saw it for himself. Vance's fine bay horse was tied to Ilara's fence post. Vance was on her porch, leaning against a post, smiling his polished smile. Ilara was standing with her arms crossed, listening. Silas was too far away to hear, but he could read the set of her shoulders. He knew that posture. It was polite, but it was unyielding. After a few minutes, Vance tipped his hat, his smile looking a little strained, and rode away. Ilara watched him go, then turned and went back to her work without a backward glance. Silas let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He didn't know why it mattered. He didn't have a claim on her. He didn't want one. He was a man who had already lived his life, loved his wife, and buried his heart. He was 48 years old. She was younger. The arithmetic was simple. It didn't add up, but the heart has a different kind of arithmetic, one that doesn't count years, but weighs actions. He had seen her coax life from dead soil. He had seen her face hardship with a quiet dignity. He had seen her turn away the easy choice, the prosperous suitor, for reasons that were her own. He was beginning to realize that what he valued was not the same as what he counted. And now, we take a short pause from our story. I want to ask you, what country are you listening from today? If you feel comfortable sharing, please drop it in the comments below. It means everything to me to know where this voice is reaching, to know that we're sharing this story across towns and states and even oceans. Thank you for that. Now, let's get back to Silas, because he's about to figure something out that has nothing to do with numbers. The first snow of the season came early that year, a light dusting that melted by noon but left a sharp bite in the air. It was a warning. Winter was coming. Silas spent the day securing his barn and checking on his livestock. He noticed there was no smoke coming from the chimney of Alara's cabin. He hadn't seen her outside all day, not for water, not to feed her chickens. A knot of unease tightened in his stomach. He told himself she was likely just busy indoors. It was not his place to check. But as the sun began to set, painting the snow-dusted peaks in shades of bruised purple and rose, the worry gnawed at him. Gus seemed to feel it too, whining softly at the door, his gaze fixed on the dark cabin across the field. Martha had always made soup when the first cold snap hit, a thick chicken and vegetable soup that filled the house with its warm, savory scent. It was a smell he hadn't allowed in his kitchen for 5 years. He didn't make a conscious decision. He just found himself moving, pulling a stewing hen from the cold box, chopping carrots and onions, his hands remembering the motions his mind had tried to forget. The house slowly filled with the ghost of a memory, the aroma of a life he once had. It didn't hurt as much as he thought it would. It just felt right. When the soup was done, he ladled it into a large jar, wrapped it in a towel to keep it warm, and put on his coat. "Stay here, Gus," he said. The dog whined but obeyed. The air was cold and still as he walked across the field. The ground was hard under his boots. A single light burned in her window, a faint, flickering orange. He knocked on the door. There was no answer. He knocked again, louder this time. "Mrs. Stevens!" he called out. "Elara!" He heard a faint sound from within, a weak stirring. He tried the door. It was unlatched. He pushed it open and stepped inside. The cabin was one small room, but it was immaculately clean and organized. A fire was dying in the hearth, little more than glowing embers. Elara was in a simple bed in the corner, bundled under a pile of quilts. Her face was pale and slick with sweat, her breathing shallow. Her eyes fluttered open as he approached. "Mr. Blackwood," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "You're sick," he said. It was a stupid thing to say, an obvious fact. "A fever," she confirmed, trying to push herself up. She fell back against the pillows, exhausted by the small effort. "It will pass." "I brought soup," he said, holding up the jar as if for evidence. He didn't wait for her to answer. He went to the hearth and coaxed the fire back to life, adding logs from the wood box beside it, until a steady warmth began to push back the chill. He found a bowl and a spoon in a crate that served as her pantry. He poured the soup, the steam rising in a fragrant cloud. He brought it to her, propping her up with another pillow. She was too weak to hold the spoon, so he held it for her. He fed her like he had fed Samuel when he was small. He was careful not to spill, waiting patiently for her to swallow each small spoonful. She didn't protest. She didn't say a word. She just accepted the gesture, her stormy eyes watching his face in the dim firelight. When she'd had enough, she shook her head slightly. He set the bowl aside. She was still shivering, despite the quilts and the growing heat from the fire. He went to the pump and drew a bucket of cold water, found a cloth, and came back to her bedside. He wrung out the cloth and gently wiped her forehead. Her skin was burning. He continued to bathe her face and her wrists, the cool water offering some small relief. Her breathing seemed to ease, her eyes closed. He thought she had fallen asleep. He stood to leave to let her rest. Her hand shot out and caught his. Her grip was surprisingly strong. He stopped, looking down at their joined hands. Hers was small and hot in his large, calloused one. Her eyes opened again, clear and direct, cutting through the haze of the fever. She looked at him, at his rough hands, at his weathered face. "No one," she said, her voice barely audible but weighted with a lifetime of truth. "No one has ever cared for me like this." The words landed in the quiet room with the force of a physical blow. He felt something inside him, something that had been frozen for 5 years. Crack! It was not a violent shattering, but a slow, deep fissure, the way ice breaks on a river in the first thaw of spring. He didn't pull his hand away. He simply stood there holding her hand until her breathing deepened into a true sleep. He stayed for a long time, keeping the fire going, changing the cloth on her head, just watching her. The arithmetic he had lived by for so long, the counting of losses, the calculation of his age, the sum of his grief, it all fell away. In its place was the simple, undeniable weight of her hand in his. It was not a number. It was a value. He walked back to his own house under a canopy of brilliant, unfeeling stars. The world was the same. The mountains were in the same place. The cold was just as sharp. But he was different. The house was no longer just an empty space. It was the place he had left to go help her. It was the place he had cooked the soup. Its silence was no longer an absence, but a quiet space for thought. For the next 2 days, he cared for her. He cooked simple meals, kept her fire going, and made sure she drank water. They spoke very little. There was no need. He would sit in the chair by her bed, cleaning a piece of tack or mending a bridle, the simple, familiar work calming his thoughts. He was just being a neighbor. That's what he told himself, just a decent man doing a decent thing. But he knew it was more than that. He knew it when he watched the steady rise and fall of her chest as she slept. He knew it when he found himself tidying her small cabin, wanting it to be right for her when she was well. He knew it when he imagined this winter, and the next, and the one after that, and he could not imagine them without the light burning in her window. On the third day, the fever broke. He arrived in the morning to find her sitting up in bed, her hair brushed, her color returned. She was drinking a cup of water, and she gave him a small, clear-eyed smile when he entered. "Thank you, Silas," she said. It was the first time she had used his given name. It sounded natural. "You're welcome, Alara," he replied. He knew then that he could not go back. He could not return to his quiet, ordered solitude. The wall was broken. The light was in, and he was terrified. He spent the next week in a state of internal turmoil. He went back to his chores, to the familiar rhythm, but his mind was elsewhere. He would find himself staring at her cabin, at the plume of smoke rising from her chimney, a sign of her restored health. He was a man of 48, a widower, a man whose heart was a closed and settled thing. She was young, with a life ahead of her. It was foolish. It was impractical. It was a violation of the arithmetic. He stood at the fence line one afternoon, looking at the two properties. His large and established, but hollow. Hers small and struggling, but filled with a stubborn, undeniable life. They were a study in contrasts. He was the past. She was the future. It made no sense to try and join them. It would be an act of selfishness on his part to tether her future to his past. He would not do it. He would be her neighbor. He would be her friend if she would have him. And that would be enough. He had told himself that before. It had been a lie then, and it was a lie now. Gus came and sat beside him, nudging his head under Silas's hand. The dog looked across the field, his tail giving a slow, hopeful thump against the ground. The dog didn't care about arithmetic. He only knew that the woman in that cabin meant warmth, meant life, meant that his master's hand was no longer so heavy with sadness. "It's not that simple, boy," Silas murmured. But maybe it was. Maybe he was the one making it complicated. What was the alternative? To go back to the silence? To watch her from a distance, maybe for years, until she finally gave in and married someone like Thomas Vance, or moved away in search of an easier life. The thought of that silence returning, deeper and more profound than before, was unbearable. He had spent 5 years honoring a memory. He had loved Martha with all his heart. Loving someone new wouldn't diminish that. It wouldn't erase it. Maybe, he thought, it would be the one thing that could truly honor it. Martha had loved life. She would not have wanted him to live in a museum of their past. She would have wanted the house to be filled with laughter again. He made a decision. It was not a decision of logic, but of instinct. It was the same instinct that had told him to build a fire in a cold cabin, the same instinct that had made him reach for the soup pot. He was going to walk across the field, he was going to stand on her porch, and he was going to say what was in his heart. He did not know the words yet, but he knew they would come. He was done with counting. He was ready to think about value. He found her splitting firewood. She had a small axe and was attacking a log with more determination than strength. She was making progress, but it was slow, hard work. He walked up to her, took the axe from her hand, and split the log in two with a single clean stroke. He set the axe down. She looked at him, her breathing heavy. "I could have done it," she said. It wasn't a complaint, just a statement of fact. "I know," he said. They stood there for a moment in the cold air, the scent of pine and snow around them. He had rehearsed a dozen speeches in his head, all of them sounding foolish and clumsy. So he said the only thing that felt real. "The work is too much for one person," he said, nodding toward her small plot of land, "and my house is too large for one person." She watched his face, her own unreadable. "I'm not a young man, Alara. I know that. I've got more years behind me than ahead, and I have no right to ask you for anything." He took a breath. "But I'm asking anyway. I'm asking you to let me help you with this place, and to let you help me fill that empty house. I am asking," he said, the words finally finding their footing, "if you would consider a partnership in all of it." It was not a proposal of marriage, not yet. It was something more fundamental, a proposal of a shared life. She looked from his face to his house on the hill, then back again. Her expression was serious. He thought she would say no. He braced himself for it. He deserved it, for his presumption. "Silas," she said, her voice soft but steady, "when I first came here, I saw you watching me from your barn, and every day since, I knew you were there. I was hoping," she said, her stormy eyes meeting his, "that one day you would walk across this field for good." Relief washed over him so powerfully his knees felt weak. She took a step closer. "I am not looking for an easy life. I am looking for a good one. My answer is yes." He didn't know what to do. He wasn't a man for grand gestures, so he just reached out and took her hand. It was cool now and strong. It fit in his as if it were made to be there. The next Sunday, he hitched his best horse to his wagon. He helped Ilara onto the seat beside him. They rode into town together. They didn't hold hands. They didn't have to. As they passed Henderson's mercantile, Mr. Henderson was standing on the porch. He saw them, and a slow, wide grin spread across his face. He lifted a hand in greeting. Silas lifted his in return. The entire town would know by noon. The partnership had been announced. We jumped forward 2 years. The fence between the two properties was gone. The fields were joined, planted with corn that stood tall and green under the summer sun. Her chickens now roamed near his barn, and a handful of her dairy cows grazed with his herd. The small cabin was still there, neat and tidy, used now as a guest house for the rare traveler or a quiet place to work. But their life was in the big house on the hill. It was no longer too large. It was filled with the scent of baking bread and the sound of 2 sets of footsteps on the wooden floors. Alara's rocking chair sat by the hearth, and her books were on the shelf next to his ledgers. The house had woken up. It was breathing again. They were married the spring after he had made his offer. A simple ceremony at the courthouse with Mr. Henderson and his wife as witnesses. It was quiet, and it was right. Silas sat on the porch, the same porch from which he had watched her wagon arrive. Gus was asleep at his feet, his old body twitching with dreams. Elara came and sat beside him, handing him a glass of lemonade. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun dip toward the mountains. He looked at her, at the way the evening light caught the gold in her hair. She had a few more lines around her eyes now, lines of laughter and contentment. She was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, her hand finding his. "Arithmetic," he said. She smiled. She knew what he meant. "I was thinking," he continued, "that a man can spend his whole life counting his losses. He can add up his years and subtract his hopes until he's left with nothing but a zero. Or he can learn a different kind of math, the kind where 1 plus 1 doesn't equal 2, but equals a whole world." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "It's a better kind of math." "It is," he agreed, his heart full. He had not expected this. He had not believed a second chapter was possible. But life, he was learning, was not a book with a fixed number of pages. It was a story you kept writing, day by day, as long as you had the courage to turn the page. And his story, he now knew, was just beginning. And so the story of Silas and Alara reminds us of a profound truth. We are often taught to measure our lives by the hard logic of arithmetic, by age, by wealth, by the years that are gone. We convince ourselves that our chances for happiness are finite, that the past dictates the future, that a heart broken once is a heart broken forever. Silas believed this. He lived inside the cold, stark numbers of his grief, in a house too large and a life too small. But Ilara's arrival introduced a different way of measuring. It was not the math of counting, but the math of value. Her worth was not in her age or her possessions, but in her character, her resilience, her quiet competence. The truest measure of a person is not found on a calendar, but in the steadfast kindness of their actions, in the fixing of a fence, the planting of a garden, the simple, profound act of caring for another human being when they are at their most vulnerable. Silas's journey was one of learning to count differently. He had to unlearn the arithmetic of doubt and embrace the calculus of the heart. The pivotal moment was not a grand declaration, but a quiet one in a sick room, a bowl of soup, a cool cloth, a hand held in the dark. It was in that moment he understood that the courage to love again is not about ignoring the past, but about honoring it by choosing to live fully in the present. It's about realizing that 1 plus 1 isn't just 2, it's a home. It's a future. It's everything. Thank you for your time and your attention. It is the most valuable thing you have, and the fact that you share it here is what allows this channel to exist. I am deeply grateful for each and every one of you. May you find the courage to measure your own life, not by the numbers, but by the richness of its value. Until next time, keep writing.